Hello and welcome to today's edition of People in Politics. After what has turned into quite an extensive break, if you followed me for a while, you'll realise that I've not recorded a podcast for some time. And the main reason for that is I moved home at the end of November, and I never understood why people said that moving house is so stressful. But believe me, I get it now. It's phenomenally stressful, and it's taken me time to get back on my feet and back up and running again. But I'm really happy to be in position to do podcasts again, and I'm really delighted to be joined today by Baroness Young. Baroness Young is a remarkable woman with a remarkable story, and I'm really looking forward to getting an insight into her life as a young person and how that's gone on to shape her career. So, welcome to People in Politics. Baroness Young, Lola, thank you so much for giving me a time like this. I'm so grateful.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. It's a real pleasure, David.
Not at all, not at all. I spent a bit of time in the festive season, and I've read a book, and I've heard you on a few other podcasts. So you're gonna have to forgive me if I ask you all the same things. And also, I feel like there's so much that I want to ask you and get through, and I'm a bit all over the place, so you'll have to just for, forgive me for that as well.
Don't worry, I forgive you in advance for all your misdemeanors.
Yeah. So, I haven't read the read. How does it feel when people say to you have a remarkable story or your story is amazing? How does that feel when people say that to you?
That's a good question, actually, especially one to start with, because I don't know, it still feels, if I can explain, it's almost like that's another person.
Mm.
Not because I'm sort of in denial about what I've achieved. I recognize that I've achieved a lot. Whatever anybody knew about my background, I understand that. But to me, because that's kind of like normal, it's like, okay, yeah, it's interesting. And in fact, when I first I had to be persuaded initially to write my story, and when I was sort of pitching it, well, when my agent sort of put it out there, I was shocked, very pleasantly surprised to find so many publishers were interested. And I kept saying, why is this interesting? It's just, it's just what I've done. So yeah, it's kind of, I don't want to appear blasé about it, or as if I'm saying, I'm so clever that that's what I expected. It's not about that. It's just more a kind of surprise that people are so interested in and have responded so well.
Hey, you said there that you took a bit of persuasion to write the book. So can you describe the process in which the book kind of came into being, how did you get over the line I'm going to write?
How long have you got?
Yeah.
I mean, in one respect, you could say it's like the best part of, I don't know, 12 years or so.
Oh.
But really, I a friend of mine said, "Oh, you must write your autobiography," and I said, "Well, why?" And then he introduced me to somebody by saying, "Oh, this is Lola, my friend Lola. She was brought up in the care system, and now she's a member of the House of Lords." And people are always kind of intrigued by that. And he said, "You should write that story, otherwise somebody else might write it for you, and you want it to be in your voice." So I did start, and I kind of made several starts. I guess I would say full starts. And then the turning point was when I discovered through another friend that it was possible to have access to my care records, the records that kept of you during your time in care. And it had never occurred to me that there would be such a thing, let alone that I would be able to have access to it. So when I eventually did get them, and that took a little while for various reasons, when I did eventually get my care notes, that kind of changed completely the way I was thinking about telling the story, because
Yeah.
it meant I had more evidence. I had evidence of things that I hadn't known about. I had corroboration of things that I'd remembered, which was always gratifying, and also there were gaps and absences. So all of those things combined to make me think, oh, I can weave the story of the first 18 years of my life around the care notes, and that's what I did in the end.
Yeah, and you did that really well, really eloquently, and right, I really got a sense of that. And right at the beginning, when I think you described you were in the office, you received a letter on an envelope, and it was almost like you received some more fragments of your life, and I got the sense of like piecing together your life bit like a jigsaw. And I wondered, what's it like not knowing where you came from? For example, I can say, I'm David Riley. I know my grandparents, my great grandparents, that they're all, I can trace them all back to Bog Irish, Irishman, and but what's it like not knowing?
Yeah, well, it's again, it's like that was my norm. So I wasn't completely lacking in knowledge. I'd had other bits of the jigsaw, if you like, across the years, from the odd relative who would come and seek me out and say a few words about the past, so I'd learn a little bit then. Through various means, I would find out these little scraps of information. And then, as you say, I received this package, which I think the most striking thing for me in the package was these two passports that had belonged to my mother. So this was all about my mother, this package. And the two passports, of course, had her photograph in them. And then that made me realize I'd not had a photograph of my mother before. I'd no idea what she'd looked like, although I had seen her. So I'd seen both my parents separately. They went their separate ways. And my mother, I saw 2 or 3 times a year until I was about 7. And likewise, I saw my father 2 or 3 times a year until I was about 12. And so, but that obviously is a long time. Then I saw my mother again and my father again, but when I was an adult, but a young adult, still in my 20s. So the last time I actually saw my mother, I was 28. And I think my father maybe in my mid 30s, but really, yeah, it was strange. It was both strange and familiar at the same time, because until you, as a child, you're talking to other children and they tell you about their lives, and you
Yeah,
think, like if it's you and you're saying about your grandparents and everything, I don't think I ever had a thought about grandparents. That wasn't anything in my life. There was no sort of sense of having, I think I say in the book that I sort of sometimes feel I came to earth fully formed at 22, because I didn't have all the details of my past, or of my, who my all my relatives were. So yeah, it was, as I say, both strange and familiar at the same time.
yeah, that must have been difficult. And of course, you were adopted at 8 weeks, and the book is called that. But you always thought it was 6 weeks. And I was glad, can you remember your first, your sort of early consciousness of Daisy and, her being your mom, you called her mom, and what was the early times of Daisy?
Yeah, that was so yes, I was fostered. My parents agreed, I think, between them, that I should be fostered. My father had another family, so I wasn't going to be going to live with them, although they knew about my existence. And so Daisy was mum to me, in spite of the fact that she was this elderly, white-haired,
Yeah.
white woman. Sort of, I like to think of her as upper working class in North London. And again, I was aware of the difference between the person I called mum and the person other people, other school kids called mum. So again, it's hard to describe, how I felt about it, because it became so normalized. And what I did think was, I did realize that Daisy was old. I mean, it was inescapable. She looked old, and on the cover of the book, you'll see that. But she was very kind to me. She looked after me. She had told me several times that I'd gone to live with her when I was 6 weeks old. But it was really interesting, and this is one of the things about when you put something out there, and people, even people that you don't know, will say something to you, and you think, oh, that's interesting. So I thought I was 6 weeks old when I went to Daisy. Turns out from the records that I was 8 weeks old. And then somebody said to me, well, look, it makes sense, because they might have gone to see Daisy with you when you were 6 weeks old, but they wouldn't have just sort of handed you over to her on the doorstep, so to speak. She was a proper registered foster mother. So maybe it was then 2 weeks afterwards that they sort of finally moved you in, as it were. And the weird thing is, David, that I'd never even thought about that as a possibility. I'd never even thought. Of course,
Yeah, that's
perfect sense. You wouldn't just say, oh, hello, we hear you're a foster mother, here's our baby.
yeah. Yeah, that's right. That's probably better. You probably visited and then 2 weeks later you may. But it's such a such a short period of time, but such a significant part of an infant's life. That and significant part of your life. Because
Mm.
for the 2 weeks with your mother, and that's, I really get the significance of that for you. And from the book, it said like, on the whole, you had a pretty, positive set of time with it, although it wasn't, it was different, but it's okay. Well, I really want to ask you is one that I got the sense that your dad wasn't actually that far away. He was in London, and how did that feel knowing that your dad was, not far away, but you didn't see him that often?
Well, they were both in London, actually. My mother was in kind of Notting Hill, I think. That's one address we had, from Portobello Road. And my father was in Streatham with his wife and his daughter, my half sister, Shade. So, but in a way, I think I wrote them out of my story, as it were. I wrote them out of my life.
Yeah.
I remember very clearly saying to a school kid in my primary school, I remember them, I don't know how we got into the conversation, but I remember saying, oh, I see my father once in a blue moon. And I didn't know what a blue moon was.
Yeah.
And so I said, that means, hardly ever. And I remember the child who it was, and he said, oh no, that's not what a blue moon is. And then he went on to describe, to tell me what an actual blue moon was. I can't remember the explanation, but I remember thinking, I just remember saying that to him. I was perfectly well aware. And I suppose if I felt upset about it, I was obviously suppressing that upset very, very thoroughly,
Yeah.
because I think because I saw them both so infrequently, again, that's what I expected. I didn't know when he might come or when she might come to see me. But again, when I look at the records, all the visits are noted. So my memory that it was very infrequent, these visits were infrequent, is absolutely confirmed by what's in the notes.
And it sounds somewhat of a kind of coping mechanism that you sort of write, you can write them out your story in a way, because it's just true, it's just a sort to think about that, and unfortunately, you were quite young when you lost Daisy. I think you discovered her, and I'm very constant the next bit of your life after Daisy. That was quite that was quite unsettled and quite difficult, and would you agree that was a difficult period?
Yeah, it was and it precipitated a long period of difficulty, because although I'd kind of known, as I said, that yes, she was old and therefore I knew she wouldn't last forever. But when she did die, I think I was 14, and there was no clear pathway for me to live with anybody, as I could see at that time. Everything was like a day-to-day basis. So that stability, at the same time as being incredibly, obviously it was painful for everybody who knew Daisy. It was very painful for me. But now I can look back and think at least I had that 14 years where it was stable. And maybe that's part of the key to me being able to sort of move on and make something of my life. Because if I'd been moved around to the extent that I know a lot of other young people in the care system are, with such frequency as they are today, or even further away from their homes and where they were initially brought up, that would have been very, very difficult to deal with. But I think the other thing I'd say is that in those days, which sounds like kind of in antiquity, which it feels like sometimes, um, uh, there wasn't anything like bereavement counselling or recognising that there was grief. I mean, at one point in my notes, one of the social workers, one of the ones that I remember very fondly, she did say that she was talking about another sort of family and say that they don't seem to recognise that Lola is grieving. And that's maybe because I wasn't showing that externally. I mean, I didn't go around in tears all the time, although I might have felt like, well, I know I felt like sort of just huddling up in a corner and crying, but I didn't ever. I think when I got the news, I just had a moment of crying. But but even if I had exhibited sort of classic bereavement signs, nobody would have done anything sort of material, because, as I say, children were almost still in that era of being seen and not heard.
Yeah.
And anyway, I wasn't sort of naturally related to her. She wasn't my birth mother, so what right did I have to grieve her?
Yeah.
That's kind of looking back how that feels now. And of course, if you don't try and work through some of that emotional baggage, then that kind of stays with you for longer than if you had. I think that's the theory about talking about it and trying to get through those stages of grieving. But yeah, that obviously didn't happen in any kind of formal sense at all.
Well, that must have been very hard. And did you have any support from Daisy's family, or when I say support, I'm in contact, because I'm aware that you spend Christmases with them. They lived upstairs, so you must have. So did they have any contact with Daisy's family after that?
That's a very complicated relationship.
Right.
So which I found out was more complicated than I'd realised when I got the care records, because Daisy's daughter Evelyn, as you say, lived up on the first floor of this house, where we lived in the basement. They lived on the first floor, and then Daisy's granddaughter, who had her own children, lived on the top floor. So these generations sort of went up the house, as it were.
Yeah.
And so we would sometimes play with Daisy's great grandchildren,
Well,
and we would see them and we'd say hello and things like that. And then, but Daisy's daughter, whom I've called Evelyn in the book, She, I know she used to row a lot with Daisy. They used to have
Right.
these fierce arguments, absolutely fierce arguments, and they wouldn't speak to each other for days or even weeks. And I, whilst I didn't really know what they were about, I think somewhere inside I thought they were related to me because my parents weren't paying for my upkeep, which meant that Daisy did because I wasn't officially in care. Daisy didn't want me to go officially into the care system. She didn't want me in a children's home. So when she died, there was no question whatsoever that her family would ever, do anything for me. On the contrary, I think they felt that I'd unfairly been sapping her financial and physical energy over the years without sort of, any kind of recompense from anybody. So there was no way that there was no question. And I don't think I ever contemplated the idea that I would actually end up staying in the same house, but living with Evelyn and the family. That wasn't going to happen. So I knew it was inevitable that I was going to have to move on. But that might sound cold and unfriendly. But the other thing why I say it's complicated is that Evelyn and her family used to make sure we had the most wonderful Christmases.
Yeah.
I mean, they would I know you sort of look back with rose-coloured spectacles on Christmases, but I mean, they were almost Dickensian in that kind of sense of masses of people gathered around the table, people who hadn't been there for years, people that Daisy had looked after in the past, come back to see her, or her adopted son had come back to see her. And all of this was great, and Evelyn would make sure we all had loads of presents. And in fact, there's one note in the care records that says, Lola is surrounded by her Christmas presents. This is, on a visit after Christmas, but she also noted that there was nothing from my father or from my mother. Yeah. So, that was, as I say, and I think one of the things that I always knew, but was kind of highlighted for me in writing about this, is that all relationships are incredibly complex. And that may sound like, oh yeah, so what, great discovery. But we sometimes forget that when people say, was it good or was it bad? Did you have a good time or did you have a bad time? Were they nice to you or were they horrible to you? Were they racist or were they not racist? It's not as simple as that. It's very, very complicated. And I think for me, it's really important and more interesting to look at those nuances and those kinds of anomalies, if you like. So on the one hand, you could say Evelyn wasn't predisposed towards people of colour, and on the other hand, you could say, but she did her utmost to make sure we had an enjoyable Christmas away from our parents.
Yeah, that's right. It sounds complicated, and I got that from the book because you spoke in the book about you had lovely Christmas, but you also spoke about the resentment that about the way underneath, and it does make for complex relationships, and I wanted to ask about the next bit of your life when you went to, I think around 2 or 3 different children, but you went to live with a couple of different families. I think you went to live with the Kyan's family, a Kyan family. There was the Brownlees, or the Browns and the Galloways, and and when I read that, I thought that you must have faced a phenomenal amount of rejection at that time. And did it feel like both that rejection, and how does that all did that all catch up with you?
Oh my goodness, yeah, you put your finger on it. I mean, because the thing about rejection, abandonment, especially as a child. So that thing they say that if your parents split up, then kids kind of feel guilty. They feel somehow they're implicated in this, in this decision to split up. So it wasn't like that, but it was very much. Well, it was more obvious to me. Obviously, there was something wrong with me. Otherwise, my parents wouldn't have decided not to kind of really seek to take me with them. Yes, they asked me, each of them asked me, did I want to go to Nigeria, but not in the kind of circumstances where I was going to go, oh, yes, please. But they didn't push it. It was left as it was. So, so yes, of course, I felt abandoned, even though I realized I was kind of wanted on some level by Daisy. Then when I went to stay with Kyan. So Kyan had been fostered with me, and we're still friends to say today, I'm pleased to say. So, and her family took me in, but that didn't work out. I think part of it was the switch from working class English life to a more, I'm not going to say middle class, but certainly very well educated professional Nigerian class was just too much, and I was also in that period of grieving that hadn't really been expressed. And I was 14. So it's like a perfect storm of hormones and, unresolved emotions and so on and so forth. And then these other names you mentioned, the Galloways and the Browns. I never even got, so with the Galloways, I stayed a weekend with them, and then they told me that wasn't going to work out, and that was kind of like, oh, okay, so they don't want me either. And then the Browns was different because I went to see them as prospective foster parents.
Yeah.
And as far as I can recall, I went on my own, which I think now looking back was quite shocking as a 15-year-old to go into a stranger's house like that. And it's like do it yourself fostering, it's like, here's your pack, now go off and get yourself fostered kind of thing. So that wasn't great to start with. But as I recall, I was there maximum of about an hour.
Oh, right. Okay.
Yeah. So, and then there was this thing of, so I thought, no, I don't. When I look back, when I remember this, I thought, I don't want to go there. I really didn't really like it. And yet the notes say something else. But the point was that whether I'd liked it or not, Mrs. Brown wrote a very, I don't know what to call it, character assassination is how I think of it, of me, based on having met me for an hour and saying why I was totally unsuitable to get a person to go and live with them. So yes, I was feeling very low at that time because I was also in a children's home. It was a long journey to school. I didn't get on with the people who ran the home. My schoolwork had suffered. I couldn't see my friends because I lived so far away from them. They didn't understand what it was like to be in the care system. Why would they? And so that was a pretty miserable time. Very miserable, in fact, yes.
Yeah, I got a sense of it being a difficult time, and I was really struck when you went to the frenzy of the story of their daughter clearing the floor who must have cerebral palsy or, and just, but that's how it was back then, and I'm really struck by that, obviously.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting that because look, and I don't want to get into that whole kind of performative, I'm with you because, disabilities and other inequality and all of that kind of stuff. But there was a level on which, because I think I also wrote, if you recall, about the play, A Day in the Death of Joe Egg.
Yeah.
And that play was about a girl with a daughter. They had a daughter with cerebral palsy. And it was a two-hander, that play, the mother and the father of the girl. The girl was on stage, and my recollection is that she doesn't speak throughout. So the whole discussion is about, the parents' failure to have the perfect daughter, if you like, if you want to put it in those terms, right? And that was a play that I chose that I wanted to see. And so for me, there was I did feel a kind of connection to people who were judged by the way they looked or the way they sounded, in the absence of actually taking the trouble to get to know them, and that they were being discriminated against as a result of that. Now, in those days, again, back in antiquity, we didn't have that kind of language to talk about that, but I just sort of immediately felt this is wrong when I saw the daughter, it wasn't just the fact that the daughter of Mrs. Brown's daughter, it wasn't just the fact that she was doing the household chores whilst the son was sitting reading in the study. It was the incredibly disparaging way in which she talked about her in front of her.
Yeah.
And again, so when I before I got the notes and I looked back on those incidents, I had to say to myself, have I misremembered this? Have I made this assumption about that woman, Mrs. Brown, and the way she spoke about her daughter, over the years? But then when I got the notes and read the letter that Mrs. Brown had written, it completely confirmed that for me, the way in which she spoke about that daughter. I mean, I know it's quite hard to read that letter, but I mean, it's to me, it's still shocking.
Yeah.
In the way she talks about us both. So that kind of sense of alliance that I would form if I did go to live there, I was thinking, yeah, we'd be together, her and I, was basically based on the fact that I thought that the mother was just so disparaging towards the daughter. Yeah.
Just going back to your notes there, I'm aware that you waited a long time to get them from, I think it was Islington.
That's correct, yeah.
And I wonder if you can describe what's it like waiting all that time, and when you finally got them, what's it like putting over your past?
Yeah. Again,
I'm asking that question somewhere. I'm asking that someone a personal thing. I know it's a very, very different circumstance, but at the terrible time, with as and I have a big pile of notes from my education days, but I can't open them.
I honestly understand. It's so again, it's a really, really interesting question. And I think for people who haven't been in that kind of situation, because what you're saying about your notes, I would say absolutely why you'd sort of feel reticent about opening them. So the delay in getting them was partly because of administrative errors, and partly because the people who worked at the council then were too young to remember or to know what had happened in the past. So, for example, I said I was living in this children's home in Hertfordshire, and the woman who was responsible for looking for records said, "Oh, but Islington doesn't have any homes in Hertfordshire." And I said, "Well, but they used to." And she said, "Well, there's no record. We don't have any record of this." And I thought, well, that's appalling that you wouldn't have any record, because what had happened in those days was that the local authorities in London, several of them had homes outside of London, and they owned those houses. So, subsequently what's happened is they've been sold to private, they've been privatized now. But so there was that delay. Then there was the delay because once they accepted that I actually had been in care, they couldn't find a folder with my name on it. And eventually they found a folder with, I told them, well, here's a list of the people I was fostered with. Amongst them was Kyan. And they found a folder with her name on it. Wow. And the irony was that she actually hadn't been officially in care because it was a private fostering arrangement and her parents paid Daisy up to date on a regular basis. Anyway, got those notes. And then it was a question of, okay, I didn't pursue it for about a year. There was about a year before we got to that stage, I think, where I thought, I can't deal with this. I'm in my 50s. What do I need this pain and heartache for? So I tried not to think about it, but it kept sort of niggling away, coming back into my consciousness. And then, I described in the book how I opened these precious documents on a bus. On a bus, on a crowded bus, it's like, how could I sort of detach myself further from these documents. And I sort of skipped through. I was looking for specific names and dates and things, and I didn't read it properly. Of course I didn't. So reading it properly took another year or so. And I think there are probably still some things that when I see the date or the heading, I think, well, I'm not going to read that. I think there's probably still some bits that I haven't read.
Yeah.
And I've met people. I was with somebody a few weeks ago, and he was in his 30s. And I said to him, "Have you got your care records?" And he said, "Yes, but I can't open them."
Yeah.
So and we were talking, and he has two, or a child, at least one child, and I said, what it is that child will want to know details about your past as that child gets older. They're little now, and maybe they can't sort of articulate that, but they will eventually. Whereas I'd always told my son everything I knew as and when I knew it.
Yeah.
So when he, having said that, when he read the book, that was a different experience, obviously, to me. And then there were lots of gaps that I was able to fill in. But it wasn't a shock to him in the sense of, he knew a lot and knows a lot. So that was easier. But then he was an adult. But, when I eventually got my records, he was, 30, around 30 or something. So it wasn't such an issue. But I think that sometimes happens, especially with the care notes. Maybe it's slightly different. That's where it might be different from your education notes, because maybe people wouldn't expect to see education notes. But it's that thing, isn't it, David, of here's somebody else, somebody who doesn't know you, defining or attempting or sort of de facto defining you for the authorities, for a system. It's not
And it has such a profound effect on the rest of your life. And I think that's the sorbet. Yeah. And I do my adoption and fostering records, but I tried to find records of my birth, and but they were destroyed. And they get destroyed when you turn 25 or whatever, and that was really hard. I found that really hard to suck up, But
sorry, when you say when you say
I'm sorry, we're going about off piece here.
we'll have to do that. We'll have to do that another time, because as far as
story.
They're not allowed to destroy records. It was my understanding.
It was records of my mother's when I was born. But yeah,
Yeah.
so they were
Well,
destroyed, and I was wondering. So that was health records.
right.
I was wondering if it was the same in the care system, that they keep the record until you're a certain age, but obviously not.
No, I mean, I think another time we could talk about the difference between the two and why that should be the case.
The whole other conversation.
But with the care records, one thing that I read when I was doing a bit of research was that some social workers around that period deliberately destroyed care records because they didn't want, that they thought they were doing children in care a good turn by destroying these records, because they didn't want them to know these harmful things about them. And then the other thing is that what happens with quite a lot of care records is that loads of paragraphs are redacted, not just names, but circumstances, and all kinds of different things. So I've seen people, I saw a woman showed me her file, one sheet of A4 with most of it redacted. And so that's not helpful for anybody. So it's a big issue, actually. And it's one of the things that I've sort of tried to be involved in and to support, is this campaign for access to care records, which would sort of see, anyway, that thing about, blacking out all of these details. I was fortunate the bits that were taken out or blacked out in my notes, those bits were usually the names, and I knew all the names. I knew everybody's names. I changed the names, but I knew everybody's name.
Oh, good. So so I think when you turn 18, you leave the care system. And you know, it's so similar to another situation with, you know, when you turn 18, it's like you're on your own, you're out there. And I wonder how that felt. And at what point in your life did you start to, I suppose, and you know, enjoy life and think, let's get, you know.
Sorry. So sorry. What were you asking there, David? I didn't catch that last bit.
I'm not quite sure.
I know you talked about the care cliff, didn't you? This thing about when you're 18, you're kind of like in the care system. That's the end of your time in the care system. I mean, it was really brutal, I would say, when I was in care. Slightly less so now, but the thing is that there's actually a name for it, so it still exists. It's called the care cliff, and the young people that I speak to a care experience, it doesn't seem to be emotionally much different to what it was when I was a kid. So, you know, there is that. And I think there is some more help. But I said to quite a few people that one of the things that struck me during the lockdown was after COVID or during COVID was to imagine somebody who's just turned 18, maybe they've been allocated a council flat if they're lucky, and they're for the first time they're having to be independent, looking after their money and food and all of that, and boom, there's a lockdown, so nobody can come and see them. You know, the support they can get, you know, just figuring out Zoom in those days, that seems like a million years ago. We were just figuring out Zoom. You know, thinking about how difficult that must have been for so many people, children and young people in the care system. It must have been very, very, very difficult indeed. So that 18-year-old thing is it's almost arbitrary. You know, everybody, it's a truism to say everybody develops at different stages at different ages. And I think in some respects, one of the kind of progressive moves has been to say that if you and your foster parents, if you're in that position, both agree, then you can stay until you're 25. Right. So, you know, but for those of us who can dimly remember what we were like when we were 18 or even 25, or when I think about young people, you know, you don't, conventional families don't just sort of cast adrift. Okay, it's your birthday, off you go. We don't, you know, you're on your own now. You kind of do that gradually. You support them. And if they need to come back to you, then they need to come back to you. But so sorry if I missed the point of your question there.
No, not at all. I think that answers quite a lot. And of course, you went on to do social work, and you were in television for a while, and then academia. And you know, do you remember a point where you really felt like the past was behind you, and you felt good about stuff?
Yes, I think so. I mean, insofar as you can, because I mean, I think you said earlier, or you implied earlier, that you can never quite leave everything behind.
No.
And you know, somebody that I used to know, that I refer to in the book, we used to say, yes, it shapes you and it informs your sort of worldview, if you like, but you can't let it define you, that experience. So that's the issue, really, about the extent to which it defined you. So for me, when I left school, I didn't get A levels good enough to go to university. So, you know, I did see myself as an academic failure, and which is almost like another form of abandonment and rejection. I was rejected from the university I applied to, so that was there. So I went on to study drama, and as you said, had that kind of career, and sort of moving throughout that, I guess what I primarily felt was whatever had happened in my background had enabled me to feel a certain kind of liberation. Yeah. So I didn't have to answer parents who would say, "What do you mean you're going on to be an actor? That's a complete waste of time," and blah 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 blah. I just thought, oh, okay, I'll give that a go, and that, so I could do it with that kind of sort of sense of freedom, really. And I was able to do that. And then if I wanted to switch careers or do something different, or engage with the arts that I loved so much, I could just do that. So to that extent, what I was drawing on from my past was a sense of independence and freedom to do what I thought would make me happy or feel content. Yeah. And I know that sort of for other people, it's not always that easy when you've got parents who have aspirations for you to be a doctor or an accountant or something, and you come home and say, well, I want to work in children's theatre. It's like, not acceptable. Yeah. So, but I could just do that. Yeah.
Maybe an advantage, And of course you said that has laws now, and so presumably politics, when was your first political consciousness, and when did you think, I want to make a difference in politics?
I always think of politics with a small p rather than any party politics. So taking it as read that that's what you're referring to. Yeah. I would say my political consciousness was when I was watching those horrible scenes on television of Black people being beaten up in South Africa and in the Jim Crow states in the United States. It was very clear to me. Nobody had to give me a lesson in racism because I faced that every day. Again, that was a kind of normalized part of my life. But to see this much more brutal, impossible to ignore violence that was being perpetrated against Black people was very hard to take. So I sort of thought, I think I knew then that I couldn't just ignore that. I couldn't just pretend that wasn't happening. So I started reading books I always cite Richard Wright and James Baldwin, amongst others, people who wrote very movingly and tellingly about civil rights movement in the US of A in particular. So it was more accessible than any books from Africa would have been at the time. So all of that was kind of like embedded in my consciousness, and I would hear snippets of debates and discussions, whether on television or radio, and I would read newspapers. We always had newspapers in the house, so they were a source of, if not factual information, just a kind of sense of what was going on in the world. And so I took that with me into acting. And again, these kinds of ideas around racism, if you like, were reinforced by the kinds of roles that people wanted me to play: a prostitute, a nurse, a bus conductor, these kinds of roles, And so I got a sense of that. And so I was involved with Equity, which is the Actors Union. The Actors Union had a subcommittee called the Afro-Asians Committee, which was all about trying to work towards a more varied, more diverse, as we'd say today, representation. So that was another form of political action. And of course, it married into this, what was going on in South Africa in particular, because around the 70s and 80s, apartheid was still, the legislative framework within South Africa, which meant that Black artists, performing artists from Britain, couldn't go and be treated as equals. And there was also this issue of so many white artists going and performing over there in a kind of tacit acceptance of the apartheid state. So to me, politics has always been wrapped up in one way or another with what I've done in work terms.
Well, as you're talking now, I'm very conscious that I've not asked you much about your experiences with racism and marginalization, of which I'm sure you've experienced phenomenal amounts of that. Of the years, particularly growing up in the 60s and 70s, it must have been a very difficult time.
Yeah, I mean, and again, I would think, you know, going back to conversations I've had with people about progress, what constitutes progress, and you know, things have changed, but not always for the better. It's not always possible to see the change, and sometimes the changes are kind of a false image, if you like. So I found it very interesting after George Floyd was murdered, how many companies, particularly in the creative but not exclusively in the creative sector, you know, came out and said, you know, we stand by Black Lives Matter, or, you know, put a black square on their Twitter accounts and all the rest of it. And then you suddenly saw this kind of, you know, multiple images of black and brown people in advertisements and everything. And then but I'm thinking, what's going on behind the camera? Who's writing the scripts? Who's commissioning the deals? Who are the head honchos in the advertising companies, et cetera, et cetera? Has that changed, or is it what we're seeing a kind of like a visual representation of an equality that doesn't necessarily exist? And I think for all of the so-called protected characteristics, you can say this. It's like you know, I don't want to sort of denigrate a particular program, and certainly not to say that actors, whether they're of color or people with disabilities or women or whatever, should be turning down roles that's so hard to come by anyway. But sometimes I look at those representations, because that was my academic field, and I think, oh, well, okay, there is a little bit of a feel of a tick box exercise here, but maybe that's what we need at the moment. I don't know, because at least somebody's getting some work and they're visible. But if that isn't more, if that isn't more substantial than simply, you know, okay, well, we've done that for this series. What do we do next time? You know, it's very complicated. Again, to go back to an original sort of way we were thinking.
As you're speaking there, you know, I'm aware once again there's so many, you know, crossovers between, you know, the story of black and brown people and story of disability and tick box, and there's a whole other, it's a whole other conversation we should have. And but yeah, like you said, but you risk saying that, oh, we're in some ways in solidarity because we're both minority, and you want to avoid that, but it's hard to avoid it when there are so many crossovers. And so I suppose one of the last things I wanted to ask you, and you have to forgive me again if this is therapy speak. It's not meant to be therapy speak, but it might well sound like it. And you know, I suppose if you know, I suppose looking back, if you were to write to or talk to yourself, you know, when you're 12, 13, or, you know, teenage Lola, what would you say to her?
Oh, it's a funny question, that, because I've anticipated that, you know, and
Yeah.
a couple of times I've been asked it even before I wrote the book. And I sort of think now it's funny, because I sort of almost turn that round sometimes and think, well, what would my 14 or 15-year-old self have said to me?
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? And so, well, what was she saying to me? And I can say that because I look at the notes and the letters that I wrote and so on. But anyway, that's I'm not trying to dodge your question. I suppose what I would say is something like uh, something suitably ambiguous, like things aren't always what they seem. So just hang on in there and see what happens.
Yeah.
Because yeah, it's I don't know, you know, and I think that, you know, often people talk about a mentor, and I suppose in a way Daisy was a kind of, not a mentor in any kind of conventional sense, but she was encouraging. She recognized that I was quite clever, and if she'd have been one of those people who thought black people were intellectually inferior, then I'm probably not probably, but I may not be where I am today.
Mhm.
And although she was old-fashioned. I mean, I just pointed out, I know we've got to finish him, but just point out that she was born in 1886.
Well,
And so when I say that, even as I say it, I still can't quite believe it.
that's
You
a
know,
whole different scenario.
so we're talking about, antiquity, real antiquity in a way, but certainly historic. And so you would have expected her to have been, brought up on empire and all these great feats of British colonialism and Queen Victoria, all of this stuff, would be swirling around. But for whatever reason, she said to me that she thought Africans were intellectually superior to white people.
Wow.
And although that's not right either, it's at least it's like a way of saying, well, of course you're clever, because that's what Africans are. And she would say, she recognized that I could write great stories and that I read a lot and everything. So all of that, is part of the parcel, as it were, alongside the despair and the depression and so on, and the sense of abandonment.
Yes, Daisy must have been a really interesting person to hold her views.
Mm, mm. As somebody said yesterday when I was explaining that, they said, "Oh, she was countercultural for her period." Yeah.
Yeah. But you have gotten, a remarkable story, and it is, it is really fascinating, and yeah, and just say thank you very much for taking the time to share a window into it with me, and I'm very grateful.
Thank you, David, for allowing me to go on a bit sometimes, and for your questions, which were really insightful. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much.